for this segment, I want to take a step back and look at the issue from an international perspective. We have an international system for sharing trial protocols and results, but as you've been hearing, the scale of underreporting is dispiriting, especially in a pandemic, and it's not an issue just about the UK. So I look forward to hearing how you think our research culture could improve. We've had some really interesting comments so far. And is the UK equipped to be a world leader in writing up, reviewing and reporting the results from clinical research? It would be exciting if it could be. And who should take responsibility for making that happen? So this is the agenda in my slide pack. A bit about the history that established the ethical duty to report trials, the role of the International Clinical Trials Registry Network, the astonishing scale of underreporting worldwide and in the UK, and the tsunami of preliminary reports of unreviewed findings of research, which COVID-19 has produced. And then let's have a discussion about the UK research environment, the government's ambition to make the UK a world leader, and for me, an important point, the impact on public trust if nothing changes. So this is a very dense slide about the history. Let's look about what happened over the last 20 years. I joined the Department of Health in 1991. I'm not a scientist. I helped the Chief Medical Officer to set up the National Institute for Health Research and the other systems for health research from 2000 to 2011. So although some of this sounds as though it's a long time ago, it feels quite personal to me. Now, in the 1990s, there was widespread concern about missing scientific evidence, including the suppression or manipulation of clinical trials that should have affected the licensing of medicines and devices. And the USA legislated in 1997 under Bill Clinton to require registration and reporting. And it strengthened the law in 2007 under George Bush. And then the USA set up its national registry, ClinicalTrials.gov, in 2000. Now, the UK didn't legislate for a national registry in the same way, but our government did sponsor the setting up of the ISRCTN registry, which I now chair. And both the US and the UK registries are deliberately international. Then other countries set up national and regional registries, and the EU's regulatory clinical trials database opened in 2004 following the harmonisation of EU law on clinical trials and licensing. Then transparency was going up the international political agenda, and in 2005, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors had required evidence of registration before publication in member journals, and the World Health Assembly agreed the rules for international public health emergencies. It also called for clinical trials registries to adopt common standards and form a network around a platform coordinated by the WHO. Then in 2008, the World Medical Association amended the Declaration of Helsinki to require registration and reporting, and ethics committees around the world asked for assurances on this score now, and British ones routinely make registration a condition of ethical approval. So for 10 years and more, we've had a solid international consensus about the ethical duty to explain risks and benefits to participants and feed results back, timely reporting to share knowledge globally in relation to safe treatments and to public health, and standards of transparency for the design and results of clinical trials. So how did this work out? Well, despite chronic underfunding, the World Health Organization established itself as the coordinating point for sharing reliable evidence from clinical trials. 17 primary registries, including ISRCTN, work to the World Health Organization's published standard, and they share data via the WHO. So the result is Standard data on nearly 600,000 studies is freely accessible on the WHO portal. The USA didn't accept the WHO standard, but its registry shares data anyway. So why is this important? Well, you can see from the chart, a quarter of the studies on the portal recruited in the USA. China, Japan and Germany contributed another quarter. Add the 9 countries on the left of the chart, and you get to 96% of the studies registered on the WHO network. 96% in 13 leading countries. 40% in countries with half the world's population. The WHO network doesn't just promote worldwide collaboration, it shares research evidence with the large majority of countries that don't have a developed research culture. The ethical duty to report the results of trials is recognised as a duty to the rest of humanity as well as to participants, especially in a health emergency. And that's all the positive side of what's been achieved. But you can hear a but coming. As the other speakers suggested, we need to shine a light on the way research teams outside the USA use ClinicalTrials.gov. The USA Registry is a pioneer and it's a remarkable gift to international clinical science. It contributes over half the studies on the WHO portal. Is that good? Most people used to think it was. 60% of the studies on the US registry are outside the USA. The problem is, it's not just the USA's decision to leave the World Health Organization. I've spelt out here again what others have said earlier about US law. It requires research results to be reported, but the target of it is trials with a regulatory impact in the USA or with US government funding. So in practice, most research teams recruiting in Europe can ignore US law. Since 2000, they've chosen to register nearly 100,000 studies in Europe on ClinicalTrials.gov. So let's take a look at what this means for reporting. The next few slides highlight the total number of studies on the US registry, how many were reported complete in the 5 years to 2018, and how many reported results to ClinicalTrials.gov. I shall look first at France and then the UK and Germany with some comparisons. France has no primary registry of its own. The French government recommends the US registry. And as you can see, under a fifth of studies in France completed in 2014 to 2018 are listed with results on ClinicalTrials.gov. France's record is no better than the world average, and that average is dragged down by the awful level of reporting from Chinese research teams using ClinicalTrials.gov. As you can see at the bottom there, 17.5% of Chinese studies with results. So what about the UK? Are our research teams showcasing a world-beating respect for scientific standards? Not really. 32% of studies on ClinicalTrials.gov recruiting in the UK with completion dates in 2014 to 2018. So what that means is that it's hard to find the evidence from 2/3 of the US registered studies which our trialists completed in the 5 years to 2018. I mean, there is room for optimism, as we've been hearing. If sponsors get organized, a big improvement is within reach. And the small ISRCTN registry, small by comparison with the US registry, is demonstrating that. Research teams using the ISRCTN registry in the UK are achieving over 60% of completed UK studies listed with results. And why is this? Well, ISRCTN actively reminds research teams when reports are overdue. And as we've been hearing, some sponsors have vigorous and well-informed research managers and CTUs who use what registries tell them and keep track and drive up reporting. Let's look at some other countries that take pride in their clinical science, because the story isn't very happy there either. So Germany does a bit better than the UK with reporting studies registered in the USA. Like the UK, it also has its own primary registry. Japan and Australia have a bit less to be ashamed of. The surprise is that their reporting is better than the USA's. That's because the USA doesn't enforce its own law. In fact, it deliberately decided recently not to enforce its own law. To recap, here are the percentages as a table. The studies completed in 2018 are at the top and in 2014 at the bottom. So this is year by year percentages of studies that by 2020 had results reported on ClinicalTrials.gov. The disparity between the countries with the worst and the best reporting is really striking, isn't it? And pressure is building up in the UK to redress this. So I look forward to hearing from you what more we could do to make a difference. Do you think we could overtake the reporting rate in Japan and Australia? I mean, it doesn't look excellent in itself. So as far as policy and regulation are concerned, the UK has a long history of promoting transparency. Ethical approval has been conditional on registration and reporting for a decade. The UK helped to build a consensus at the WHO on timely reporting and advocated harmonising the policy of funders, leading to a consensus statement in 2017. And the main UK funders of trials have adopted policies requiring timely reporting. Then, as we've heard, in 2018, the Commons Science and Technology Committee criticised many universities vigorously, and they criticised the HRA for not having systems to detect and challenge underreporting. And partly their irritation was because they were following up a really critical report in 2013. And when the Health Research Authority was set up, some provisions about promoting transparency were written into its legal basis. And I'll come back to this later in questions if you like. Now, the National Institute for Health Research took a very strong position in 2020, requiring all prioritized COVID-19 studies to be registered with ISRCTN. And it's been asking whether ISRCTN could widen the scope so as to include public health studies with a similar impact, as well as clinical trials. And of course, lately, the Health Research Authority has published its transparency strategy, Make It Public. But it did record in it that 25% of clinical trials of medicines are not reported, and worse still, participants were not informed of the results of 90% of clinical trials, according to the figures that it looked at. The pandemic does make this question more urgent. COVID-19 has suspended many areas of research, but it's also stimulated a massive and impressive research effort to understand and treat the virus. But in their haste to run COVID studies and get findings out, researchers worldwide are rushing to publish preliminary results on preprint servers such as Medrxiv. Sorry, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. That X in the middle is a Greek letter chi. You can go and ask the people who run Medrxiv why they chose to do that. So the trend is startling, isn't it? Look, from 37 articles on COVID-19 in January, now there are nearly 7,500. Meanwhile, very few reports of considered final results are appearing on trial registries. So how can the peer review process and our reporting systems keep up with all of this? Governments desperately need to identify robust, verified results and sort them out from the preliminary and often speculative findings and hastily designed studies with inadequate cohorts. Here's a couple of examples about the evidence gap. Journalists can almost all nowadays pronounce dexamethasone and remdesivir. And here's dexamethasone. A quick search of ClinicalTrials.gov reveals thousands of trials which feature dexamethasone, but only hundreds listed with results. For remdesivir, the gap between results on registries and reports of preliminary findings is even wider. Meanwhile, we all know what fills the evidence gap. Remember when hydroxychloroquine was a miracle cure? Now, I'd like to stop taking you through slides and hear from you. What does all this tell us about the governance of clinical research in the UK and the UK's place in the wider scene? This slide suggests some possible themes for our discussion, but it's a complex question and I want to know what you think. So over to you. James, would you like to turn to the discussion?
Certainly, that's great. Thank you very much, Mark. That was really, really interesting. So we really like Mark's posted a number of very interesting, I think, very topical questions in his final slide, indeed throughout the presentation. So I'd really like to hear everyone's views. We've had a few comments so far. A question about the slide you shared earlier, Mark. Tilbrook asked, when you said with results on ClinicalTrials.gov, did you include in those numbers linked journal articles or only tabular summary results?
I didn't make a distinction. We can obviously take a similar look at what's on ISRCTN. You know, the way that people post results is a bit miscellaneous. There are some people who are inhibited from posting results because they haven't got a link to a journal article. But one of the purposes of making the results available on trial registries was to fill the gap of unreported studies that didn't end up being published in a well-respected journal. And there's a very good record now of producing summary results. the standard for doing that is developing, and if you go to ISRCTN, then you can get help to put together a summary of results in a form that won't preempt eventual publication. I mean, I'm grateful to Till for raising that point, because the idea of registries is to make the outcome from trials known, whether or not they ended up in a journal article. But then there's quality control.
Thank you. A comment from Jana Schreim. I believe ClinicalTrials.gov also sends reminders if updates should be made to a registered ongoing trial. Sorry, I read that wrong. So you get reminders from ClinicalTrials.gov if updates should be made to a registered ongoing trial. Is this not the same for ended trials, which should have results posted? So, you know, do the reminders keep coming once the trial has ended, but the results haven't gone up?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been on the receiving end of reminders from ClinicalTrials.gov what they look like. We've spent on with the ISRCTN registry, we spent quite a lot of time discussing what kind of reminders would be constructive for people to receive and which ones might just vex them because they think they're being nagged. So there's a question which I think I'd be interested to hear others' comments on, about the benefits of, if you like, telling people that they are a year overdue and they really ought to get their act together, versus telling them that a deadline is coming up in 3 months' time and would they get organised?
I think that's a great question. I'd like to pose that to everyone attending. We have over 130 of you here, so we really want to hear your views on the issues that Marc's raising. Claire Snowden had a comment saying the metrics used to define when a trial should have reported needs to be clearer. A cancer study may publish its primary endpoint results within a few years from completion of recruitment, but the end of trial may not be declared for many years to come, while secondary endpoints accumulate. The legal requirement is to report within 1 year of end of trial, but it seems that trials are being selective for underreporting when they haven't actually reached the end of trial. And she says that the reasons for not reporting also need to be better understood. So what's your view, Marc, on kind of whether the metrics we have for when a trial should be reported, are they fit for purpose? Are they perhaps not so applicable to certain types of trial compared to others?
Well, I think they are a bit rough and ready. I mean, with there being such a wide gap, it concerns me less, I suppose, than perhaps it should for people who are actually have to do it. But the reminders that ISRCTN has been sending are as often as not producing, oh yes, I should have updated the real date of the trial, the end of my trial. And there is a bit of flexibility to comment, to say what the situation is for different ways of interpreting the end point. I mean, I think there's it's important to focus on what this is for, because I had a rather interesting exchange with the German science minister's officials about a complaint that came from the Nordic Cochrane Centre to do with a study that was a very wide-reaching and had been producing publications about some aspects of it, but the data on a really important clinical problem wasn't being made available. Now, I don't know what attitude you would take to that. I mean, it's the impact that seems to me to be important. If you know that your trial has produced a large data set about an important problem and there's no way for the Cochrane people to do their work without it, then perhaps you ought to think about your moral responsibility to give access to the data, rather than thinking whether you're going to be potentially be fined by the FDA for failing to keep up with the law on ClinicalTrials.gov.
Thank you, that's very helpful. In your question, what would be better, a deadline or reminders? Angelica thinks the deadline would be better. And Greg asked a question, do you believe the temporal trend in the decline of posted results on ClinicalTrials.gov is partly due to the rising number of trials being reported on other registries?
Possibly. I mean, it seems to me that the enormous number of trials from all over the world that have ended up on ClinicalTrials.gov wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if ClinicalTrials.gov belonged to a government that wanted to go on being part of the World Health Organization, and it was part of an international collaboration to be more supportive to researchers so as to get the evidence out. I mean, that's what it's all for, after all.
Thank you. A comment from Jana. The ISRCTN is much more diligent and detailed, with ClinicalTrials.gov reminding to update only once a year, as far as she remembers. So that's good to know. Okay.
Well, that's correct. That's correct and deliberate. So hence our worry about annoying people who feel that that they had only just managed to get to our last reminder in their mailbox when we got another one.
It is a tough balancing act, but you know, how far do you go in reminding people what they probably deep down know that they need to be doing and would have done if other pressures weren't on them, which I think leads to the broader question of, as both Birgit and Patricia touched upon in their presentations, how do we kind of facilitate a culture where researchers and the administrators who support and facilitate them have the space to do these things, along with doing all the other things that they feel they have to do that get in the way of them fulfilling these very important requirements, which aren't just legal, but they're ethical. They're not sort of kind of like an add-on to good research practice. They're an essential part of it.
Well, I think Till has put this from a slightly different perspective in the title of. Sorry, I'm looking off camera because I'm looking at a webinar that he has organised for, I think, about a week's time. Perhaps he can give us everybody the details. But it's about productivity, and it's not, I mean, you can go all for value for money, but it's about being realistic and about the way that we can do the research which is likely to produce a result that has impact. Now, I know that the disciplines of competitive excellence are supposed to produce this by a sort of process of striving amongst researchers, but the spirit behind the National Institute for Health Research was to encourage collaboration so as to enable people to do research on a large enough scale that the results would have a real impact. And I know that it feels as though it's a long way from the point that you raised to the one that I'm putting in my answer, but it's actually quite an urgent question for the UK, how to organise ourselves so that the research, the medical research that we do is within the capacity of the number of people that we have available to do it properly. And how can we support them given all of the other pressures that clinicians have to put to respond to in the rest of their job. I'm deliberately not using in their day job because that was an old-fashioned view of the way clinical research was done, sort of illicitly on a back staircase when people couldn't be seen by the hospital manager. But it's just to finish this point, James, I think it's really important for everybody to understand how under-resourced the UK is. I mean, train an astonishingly small number of clinicians and science and technology and engineering, etc., graduates, compared with the countries that aspire to be leaders. I mean, I've got some old figures from about 2016, which say that China managed to produce 4.7 million STEM graduates that year, and India 2.6 million. Now, obviously, you have to scale back for the size of the population, but in the same year, we managed 80,000 and 9,000 graduates in medicine. So if you think about how many of those people can possibly become productive clinical researchers, we really need to get our act together so that the systems for getting them from designing studies to producing impactful results work properly. And clinical trial registries are just one part of that.